The year was 1776. While revolutions reshaped nations, another revolution began quietly on paper. Adam Smith, a Scottish moral philosopher from Kirkcaldy, released The Wealth of Nations, a text that turned moral philosophy into an analytical science of production and exchange. Smith's world was pre-industrial. Merchants traded across the Atlantic, laborers toiled under feudal remnants, and economists did not yet exist as a distinct profession. His goal wasn't to celebrate greed, as later caricatures claimed, but to understand the forces of coordination, how self-interest could unintentionally weave social harmony. Smith built upon Newtonian order, believing that just as gravity bound the planets, market forces could bind human actions into balance. He defined wealth not as gold or silver, but as the annual produce of the land and labor of the society. This shift, from stockpiled treasure to productive output, was radical. It reframed entire economies from static collections to dynamic systems of exchange. Smith's political economy wasn't politics nor commerce alone, but a bridge between ethics, production, and policy, a framework that would later become economics itself. Smith's most transformative insight came not from kings or merchants, but from the pin factory. He observed that 10 men dividing tasks could produce 48,000 pins a day, whereas working alone, each could scarcely make 20. From this, Smith derived the division of labor, the principle that productivity grows exponentially when tasks are specialized and repetitive. But Smith saw deeper than mechanics. He recognized the cognitive economy of specialization. Focus reduces coordination costs and enhances tacit skill. Each worker, by mastering one motion, unconsciously advances the entire system's efficiency. He also warned of its dangers, that monotony could dull the worker's intellect, a concern later echoed by Marx and Durkheim. Still, Smith believed that rising productivity was the moral and material foundation of progress. By linking labor specialization to national wealth, he mathematically shifted economics from zero-sum mercantilism to positive-sum growth. The division of labor, in Smith's eyes, wasn't merely about production. It was a mirror of human interdependence. It proved that the prosperity of nations rests on cooperation through markets rather than command. Perhaps no metaphor in economics has been more enduring or misunderstood than Smith's invisible hand. He suggested that individuals pursuing their own interest are led by an invisible hand to promote ends which were no part of their intention. It was not mystical. It was a system of decentralized optimization. In modern terms, the invisible hand resembles a self-adjusting general equilibrium. Prices act as information signals, reallocating resources toward efficiency without central command. Smith's moral foundation was essential here. He did not worship self-interest. He trusted human sympathy to anchor it. In the theory of moral sentiments, he explained that empathy and self-interest coexist, a dual engine of economic order. Thus, when traders compete, they don't coordinate through kindness, but through price discovery. Markets, like ecosystems, find equilibrium through feedback loops. This insight would shape future mathematical economics, from Walras's equations to Hayek's spontaneous order. The invisible hand was, above all, an early model of complex adaptive systems long before the term existed. Smith's economics cannot be separated from his ethics. Before writing The Wealth of Nations, he spent decades teaching moral philosophy. To him, markets were moral spaces, not in their perfection, but in their potential. He believed a just society required both liberty and restraint. Freedom in markets was vital, But unchecked accumulation could erode sympathy, community, and civic virtue. Smith imagined a commercial society where self-interest generated prosperity and prosperity nurtured virtue, if supported by justice, education, and trust. He distrusted monopolies, protectionism, and state favoritism, warning that people of the same trade seldom meet together. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. This moral skepticism made Smith an early critic of corporate collusion centuries before antitrust law. For him, economics was never about wealth alone. It was a social science of flourishing, a balance of efficiency and empathy. Adam Smith died in 1790, but the machine he set in motion never stopped. His vision evolved into classical economics, refined by Ricardo, challenged by Marx, revived by Keynes, and reinterpreted by modern growth theorists. Every debate in economics today, from inequality to automation, echoes Smith's dual concern: productivity and morality. In the 21st century, the invisible hand faces new tests: digital monopolies, AI-driven labor displacement, climate externalities, and data as capital. Yet Smith's core message endures: that prosperity emerges when self-interest operates within moral and institutional boundaries. He would have likely welcomed behavioral economics, sustainability metrics, and institutional reforms as part of that moral evolution. Economics, as Smith began it, was never merely about wealth, but about how we live with one another in pursuit of it. By the early 19th century, Europe was shifting from philosophy to precision. Adam Smith had described the orchestra of commerce, but David Ricardo wanted to understand its sheet music. Born in 1772 to a London family of Portuguese Jewish descent, Ricardo began as a stockbroker on the London Exchange. There, surrounded by the chaos of bonds, currencies, and speculation, he trained his mind to see patterns behind human behavior, numbers that pulsed beneath emotion. While Smith worked from moral theory, Ricardo worked from equilibrium. His masterpiece, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, 1817, sought to reduce the market to quantifiable law. He formalized concepts Smith hinted at: labor value, rent, capital, and trade, not as moral tales, but as equations of interaction. Ricardo saw the economy as a set of constraints and incentives, an early systems model. Prices were not moral signals, but mathematical consequences of scarcity and productivity. In doing so, he helped economics evolve from moral philosophy into an analytical science. Ricardo's starting point was deceptively simple. What determines value? He agreed with Smith that labor is the true source of value, that goods derive worth from the human effort required to produce them. Yet Ricardo added precision. He distinguished between use value, what satisfies needs, and exchange value, what something trades for, showing that market prices fluctuate around a deeper gravitational center: labor time. This was the beginning of value theory, the attempt to map production into numerical relation. Ricardo recognized, however, that not all labor is equal. Skilled work, machinery, and capital complicate the equation. Thus began the earliest struggle with what would later become marginal analysis: how to reconcile abstract labor value with market price dynamics. Though Marx would later radicalize Ricardo's ideas, Ricardo himself sought only one thing: stability. If value could be measured through labor, then economic order could be predicted through time, like physics applied to production. Ricardo's most revolutionary insight came not from factories, but from ships. In his theory of comparative advantage, he demonstrated that nations benefit from trade even if one is more efficient at producing everything. What matters is relative efficiency, the opportunity cost of producing one good over another. If England excels in cloth and Portugal in wine, both gain by specializing and exchanging. This was a mathematical triumph of logic over nationalism. Comparative advantage explained why free trade could raise global welfare, a foundational idea that still shapes the World Trade Organization and modern globalization. Ricardo's equation stripped politics away from trade. It wasn't about dominance, but optimization. Yet beneath the abstraction lay deep moral questions. Could nations dependent on trade preserve autonomy? Could efficiency coexist with justice? Ricardo believed it could, but the centuries after him would test that belief with tariffs, wars, and global imbalances he never foresaw. Ricardo's theory of rent tackled a different problem: the rising cost of land in an industrializing world. He observed that as population grows, demand for food increases, forcing cultivation of less fertile land. Rent, therefore, is not payment for labor, but for the fertility differential between superior and inferior soils. This idea revolutionized how economists viewed resource distribution, showing that rent is a surplus, not a cost of production. It also led Ricardo to his famous iron law of wages, that competition among workers drives wages toward subsistence unless productivity outpaces population. Here, Ricardo glimpsed the structural tension between capital and labor long before Marx, a system where growth naturally creates inequality unless countered by innovation or policy. His rent theory became one of the earliest models of diminishing returns, the precursor to modern resource economics and land value taxation. Every debate on housing, agriculture, or urban rent traces its roots back to Ricardo's pen. Ricardo died at age 51, but his equations outlived empires. He left behind a blueprint for economic reasoning, a discipline that could quantify human activity with the rigor of mathematics. His models shaped classical economics, influenced Marx's critique, and informed 20th century trade policy. Yet his legacy is not simplicity. It is structure. He built the first true economic model: abstract, idealized, predictive. Ricardo believed that clarity came from abstraction, that to see society's motion, one must remove the noise of emotion. That belief would dominate economics for 2 centuries, for better and worse. Today, every spreadsheet modeling GDP growth or trade imbalance owes something to Ricardo's quiet precision, the mind that saw beauty in balance sheets and order in exchange. Where Smith gave economics a soul, Ricardo gave it a skeleton. In the late 18th century, the world was growing fast. Population, trade, and industry all surging in momentum. Yet beneath the optimism of progress, one man saw a shadow forming. Thomas Robert Malthus, born in 1766 to a scholarly English family, was a clergyman with a mathematical mind. He observed that humanity's greatest triumph, its ability to multiply, could also become its undoing. In 1798, he published an essay on the principle of population, a quiet bombshell that shattered Enlightenment confidence. His central thesis was brutally simple: population grows geometrically, while food supply grows only arithmetically. In plain terms, people multiply faster than resources can sustain them. This imbalance, Malthus argued, condemned society to cycles of abundance and famine, prosperity and collapse. He wrote not as a pessimist, but as a realist, someone trying to map the hard limits of biology onto the optimism of economics. Malthus brought nature back into the discussion of wealth, reminding humankind that progress still bowed to the laws of the earth. Malthus believed population growth was both inevitable and self-correcting. When food and wages rose, families had more children. As population grew, food scarcity returned, wages fell, and poverty spread. These Malthusian cycles would, he argued, persist forever, a natural oscillation between plenty and want. His insight introduced the idea of diminishing returns in human existence. Unlike Ricardo, who saw diminishing returns in soil, Malthus saw it in biology itself. The engine of growth, human reproduction, carried within it the seed of collapse. To him, famine, disease, and war were not anomalies. They were nature's way of rebalancing excess. Malthus believed that without moral restraint, delayed marriage, smaller families, society would forever be pulled back to subsistence. His work was chilling precisely because it replaced divine punishment with natural law, a mechanical check on unchecked desire. In the optimism of early industrial England, most thinkers believed in infinite progress, more machines, more output, more people. Malthus stood apart. He introduced the idea of scarcity as the fundamental constraint of economics. For him, every new acre of farmland, every machine, every policy would eventually meet the wall of finite resources. This perspective seeded a revolution. It reframed economics as the study of constraints rather than expansion. Malthus's work foreshadowed environmental economics, resource depletion theory, and even modern ecological modeling. He saw society as an organism bounded by nature's metabolism, where energy, fertility, and entropy defined the limits of civilization. Ricardo and Smith saw markets as self-correcting. Malthus saw nature as the final arbiter. He was the first economist to introduce biophysical realism, the understanding that no market can escape the boundaries of its material base. Malthus was widely misunderstood and fiercely criticized. Reformers like William Godwin and later Karl Marx accused him of blaming the poor for their suffering. To many, his theory seemed cold, suggesting that starvation was a natural outcome. Yet Malthus was not advocating cruelty. He was describing a system too large for sentiment. His arguments shaped public policy for over a century. They influenced Britain's poor laws, guided colonial administration, and later shaped Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin admitted that reading Malthus gave him the key idea of natural selection, that species, like societies, grow faster than their resources, and only the fittest survive. In that sense, Malthus transcended economics. He became a natural philosopher of limits, a precursor to ecology and population biology, the man who discovered that competition was nature's arithmetic. 2 centuries later, Malthus's arithmetic still haunts us. From overpopulation fears to climate change, from food scarcity to water wars, his principle of limits remains relevant, though reinterpreted through data and technology. The 20th century saw moments of vindication and refutation. The Green Revolution shattered his pessimism by increasing yields beyond expectation. Yet environmental degradation and resource depletion revived his warnings. Modern economists have coined neo-Malthusian theories, integrating population dynamics with ecological footprints and planetary boundaries. In the 21st century, the Malthusian trap has become a metaphor for any system that grows faster than its foundation, from debt to data storage to energy demand. Malthus taught that every civilization eventually faces a question of balance. How much growth can the world sustain before arithmetic turns against us? The 19th century was an age of machines and revolutions, the factory smoke rising alongside the ideas of liberty and reform. Amid this tension stood John Stuart Mill, child prodigy, philosopher, and economist. Educated by his father James Mill and mentored by Jeremy Bentham, Mill was raised within the strict logic of utilitarianism, the belief that the moral worth of any action lies in its capacity to produce happiness for the greatest number. But Mill's life would become a long negotiation between logic and empathy. He saw that economics, while powerful, was dangerously immoral if detached from human well-being. As factories multiplied and wages fell, Mill realized that progress measured by output alone could hollow out the soul of society. Through his works, Principles of Political Economy, 1848, and On Liberty, 1859, he reimagined classical economics not as an engine of production, but as a moral system, where liberty, justice, and education were as vital as capital and labor. Mill's most lasting contribution was his defense of liberty, not merely as political freedom, but as the foundation of moral and intellectual growth. He argued that individuality is not an indulgence, but a necessity for progress. In On Liberty, Mill defined a single guiding principle: the freedom of each person should extend until it harms another. This harm principle became one of the cornerstones of modern liberal thought. For Mill, freedom was not only a political ideal, but an economic one. He warned that unchecked majority opinion could be as oppressive as monarchs. In a world of accelerating mechanization, conformity could strangle creativity and innovation, the very engines of prosperity. Thus, Mill fused economics with psychology. He believed that free minds, like free markets, generate diversity, resilience, and progress. But liberty, he insisted, required education, not chaos. True freedom was an art cultivated by intellect and virtue. Utilitarianism taught that the good of society could be measured by its total happiness. But Mill refined the doctrine. He distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, the happiness of intellect and moral sentiment versus the mere gratification of appetite. For him, a society that valued comfort over character was not progressing, but decaying. This distinction reframed economics as a moral instrument. Wealth and growth mattered only insofar as they improved human well-being. In Mill's framework, policies and production were to be judged not by profit, but by their capacity to elevate thought and justice. He saw economics as a transitional science, one that would eventually evolve into a social art. Once the necessities of life were secured, Mill imagined humanity turning its energies toward creativity, cooperation, and philosophy. It was a vision of post-scarcity ethics, centuries ahead of its time. Mill's Principles of Political Economy introduced one of the most forward-thinking ideas in classical economics: the stationary state. He foresaw that the constant chase for expansion would one day reach its natural limit. But unlike Malthus, who saw limits as tragedy, Mill saw them as opportunity. He believed that once material needs were met, progress could continue through moral and intellectual refinement, rather than endless consumption. In this, Mill anticipated ecological economics by nearly a century. He imagined a world of sufficiency, where technology stabilized population and production, and society focused on equality, education, and happiness. The stationary state was not stagnation, but balance, a form of equilibrium between human ambition and planetary capacity. Mill thus became the bridge between classical growth theory and sustainable thought, the first economist to envision prosperity without expansion. Mill's influence extends far beyond economics. His works shaped feminism, education reform, social justice, and modern democracy. He argued passionately for women's suffrage and equal opportunity, insisting that no society could be just while half its citizens were constrained. In economics, his humanistic approach softened the cold mechanics of the market. He reminded future generations that progress without virtue is hollow, and liberty without empathy is fragile. Mill's ideas formed the ethical skeleton of modern liberal economies, those that seek both freedom and fairness. His synthesis of philosophy and economics remains the most enduring, that the good life is not measured by how much we consume, but by how freely and wisely we live. For Mill, liberty was not the opposite of order. It was order perfected by reason. The world Marx was born into was one of steam, soot, and upheaval. Factories stretched like iron cathedrals across Europe, powered by coal and crowded by human hands. The Industrial Revolution had done what no war or empire could. It reorganized life itself. In this new landscape, labor was no longer tied to seasons or craft. It was measured in hours, productivity, and profit. Karl Marx, born in Trier, Germany in 1818, watched this mechanization of humanity with both fascination and horror. Where others saw progress, he saw alienation, the separation of workers from the products of their labor and from themselves. While thinkers like Smith, Ricardo, and Mill described how markets functioned, Marx wanted to understand why they failed. To him, the economy was not a neutral machine. It was a living struggle between those who owned the means of production and those who sold their labor to survive. His mission became to expose the gears of this system, to reveal the hidden laws of motion within capitalism itself. At the heart of Marx's economics lies his critique of value, his response to Ricardo's labor theory. Marx agreed that labor created value, but he saw something missing: surplus value, the difference between what workers produce and what they are paid. That difference, he argued, is the source of profit, extracted from labor through ownership and control of production. This insight reframed the entire system. Profit was not the reward for innovation or risk. It was the institutionalized form of exploitation. The worker's time became a commodity, purchased below its real worth, generating surplus for those above. For Marx, this was not mere injustice. It was an inherent feature of capitalism. He saw capital not as money or machinery, but as a social relation. One class possessing the means to make others work for them. Every wage, every product, every factory ledger concealed this invisible transaction, value siphoned from labor through the quiet machinery of exchange. Beyond economics, Marx was a philosopher of estrangement. In the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, he described how capitalism turns human creativity into commodity. A worker no longer owns what he makes. The product stands against him as something foreign. His labor becomes external, forced, alien. 4 forms of alienation follow: from the product, from the act of production, from fellow workers, and from one's own potential. Each represents a fragment of humanity severed by the industrial order. Marx believed that under this system, freedom itself became inverted. The more productive a worker became, the more dependent he was on those who profited from his output. Machines, meant to liberate, instead disciplined. Efficiency turned into control. For Marx, the greatest tragedy of capitalism was not poverty. It was dehumanization masked as progress. Marx argued that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. Its pursuit of profit drives overproduction, competition, and falling rates of return. Each boom ends in crisis. Factories overfilled, workers unemployed, wealth concentrated. He called it the contradiction of capital. Productivity rises, yet human welfare stagnates. In the Communist Manifesto, 1848, co-written with Friedrich Engels, Marx declared that history is the story of class struggle. The bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, and the proletariat, the workers, are bound in perpetual conflict. This struggle, he predicted, would culminate in revolution. Not a single uprising, but a transformation of how production itself is organized. For Marx, revolution wasn't merely political, it was systemic, an evolution of economic structure. Just as feudalism gave way to capitalism, so too would capitalism yield to something beyond it. A society where the means of production are collectively owned and labor serves humanity, not profit. Karl Marx died in 1883, buried quietly in Highgate Cemetery, but his ideas outlived every empire that ignored them. His theories inspired revolutions, guided movements, and reshaped the intellectual terrain of the 20th century. Yet beyond politics, Marx remains a mirror for modernity. Automation, inequality, and corporate power echo his warnings. Today, algorithms extract data the way factories once extracted labor. New forms of surplus, new kinds of alienation. Whether one accepts or rejects his conclusions, Marx's genius lay in his method, his insistence that economics is not a static science, but a living process shaped by power, technology, and time. He saw the world as machinery, not of metal, but of human relations in motion. To understand it, he believed, was the first step to changing it. In the hum of modern industry and the glow of digital screens, the machinery of capital still turns, and the voice of Marx still murmurs from within its gears. France, 1803. The embers of revolution still glowed across Europe, and the world of commerce was rebuilding itself from chaos. In this fragile new order, Jean-Baptiste Say, a former merchant turned thinker, published Traité d'économie politique, a treatise on political economy. He was neither a radical nor a bureaucrat, but something rarer, a moral optimist of enterprise. Say believed that wealth was not the accumulation of gold, but the circulation of value. He drew from Adam Smith's ideas, but added a distinctly French sensibility, clarity, proportion, and belief in creative industry. To him, the entrepreneur was the central figure of economic life, the one who perceives needs, organizes resources, and transforms imagination into goods. Where others saw trade as static, Say saw motion, a self-regulating network of exchanges. His insight would become known as Say's Law. Products are paid for with products. In this law lay the seed of one of the most enduring and misunderstood ideas in economic history. At the core of Say's thinking was a simple but revolutionary proposition. Production itself is the source of demand. When goods are created, incomes are generated. When incomes are spent, other goods are purchased. Thus, every act of production sets in motion a chain of consumption. Say rejected the mercantilist fear of gluts, the idea that markets could be chronically oversupplied. He argued that general overproduction is impossible because supply and demand are two sides of the same transaction. Crises, he said, arise not from inherent imbalances, but from temporary misallocation, poor coordination, policy failure, or hoarding of money. To modern ears, Say's law sounds almost naive, yet it was the theoretical foundation for a century of economic stability and policy. Where Marx saw contradiction, Say saw adjustment. Where Malthus saw limits, Say saw elasticity. He believed human ingenuity would always redirect surplus into new opportunity. Say elevated the entrepreneur to heroism. Long before the modern startup or industrial capitalist, he recognized the role of the innovator, the individual who combines labor, capital, and knowledge to create value. For Say, entrepreneurship was not speculation. It was coordination, a form of intelligence applied to the economy. This was a profound shift. Classical economists spoke of labor, land, and capital as impersonal forces. Say added the human element, the agent who mobilizes them. He described entrepreneurs as the prime movers in production, whose judgment and risk-taking transform potential into progress. This insight foreshadowed modern business economics and innovation theory. It was Say's entrepreneur, not Smith's invisible hand, who gave the market its heartbeat, a visionary force turning supply into structure, chaos into motion. To Say, entrepreneurship was both moral and mechanical, the art of making equilibrium real. Say's optimism met fierce resistance. Thomas Malthus warned that production could outpace consumption, that gluts were real and cyclical. Say countered that such crises were not failures of production, but failures of coordination and confidence. To him, the cure was not less supply, but freer markets. For more than a century, Say's view prevailed, until the Great Depression shattered its logic. Factories stood silent, workers jobless, and goods unsold. John Maynard Keynes resurrected Malthus's warning, arguing that demand could indeed collapse and drag supply down with it. Say's law, once a pillar of orthodoxy, was overturned by Keynesian economics. Yet even Keynes respected Say's intellectual architecture. The idea that the economy is a circulatory system, not a battlefield. Modern macroeconomics still oscillates between them. Say's belief in production-led recovery and Keynes's faith in demand-led stimulus. Together they form the tension at the heart of every economic policy debate. Jean-Baptiste Say died in 1832, but his law endures in subtle forms. Every supply chain, every startup ecosystem, every productivity model carries echoes of his optimism, that human creativity perpetually regenerates demand. In the digital age, Say's law reappears as the logic of innovation, new technologies creating markets that didn't exist before. From microprocessors to renewable energy, the act of creation remains its own justification. Yet Say would have cautioned modern economies against hubris. Even he admitted that the market's harmony required trust, competition, and access, the invisible virtues behind the visible flow. His legacy is less about perfection than faith. Faith that human ingenuity is the ultimate renewable resource. For Say, the economy was not a system of control, but a living organism, a dance of production and imagination where motion itself is prosperity.